When I bought my lakefront property 5 years ago, it was my dream come true. A modest two-story cabin with a wraparound deck, nestled between tall pines and overlooking a sparkling blue stretch of water. I had worked for 20 years in construction, saved every spare dollar, and finally had a place where I could spend weekends fishing, kayaking, and restoring my father's old wooden boat. At first, life here was peaceful. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly retirees or seasonal visitors. The HOA existed, but it was almost invisible in the early days. Occasional newsletters, reminders about lawn maintenance, and a yearly barbecue. I didn't mind paying the small fees, but as time passed, a new president was elected, and everything began to change. Her name was Diane Archer. She was tall, sharp-featured, and spoke like every word she said was a decree. Diane had moved in from out of state 2 years ago, and from the moment she took over the HOA, the rules multiplied. Driveway widths, fence heights, even the color of holiday lights. She patrolled the neighborhood like a general surveying her troops, jotting notes into a leather-bound planner. I stayed out of her way, until the day she decided to come after my boat. It was a warm spring morning when I was in the driveway sanding the hull. The boat was my pride and joy, a 1960s mahogany beauty that my father had bought second-hand and restored with his own hands. After he passed, I took over the upkeep, and it became both a hobby and a connection to him. I'd park it in my driveway between outings on the lake, keeping it covered with a heavy tarp. I heard footsteps crunching on gravel before I saw her. Diane stood at the end of my driveway, wearing a crisp white blouse and oversized sunglasses, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice flat, "we have a problem." I put down my sander. "Morning, Diane. What's the problem?" She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the boat like it was a crime scene. "Per the new HOA regulations, boats may not be stored in driveways for more than 24 hours. This is an eyesore, and it's lowering property values." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "It's been here for 3 days while I fix it up. I'm taking it out this weekend." Her mouth tightened. "That's not acceptable. You'll need to move it immediately or face a fine of $250 per day." Something in me snapped, not because of the fine, but because of the smug certainty in her tone, the assumption that she could dictate what I did on my own property. I took a step closer. "You do know this is my driveway, right?" She didn't flinch. "It's still subject to community standards." I crossed my arms. "And you do know that I own the dock and the shoreline behind my property, right?" Not the HOA that made her hesitate just for a second, but then she regained her composure. "The board will discuss it further, but for now, consider this your official warning." She turned on her heel and walked away, her perfume lingering in the air like an unwanted guest. I stood there, staring at the boat, my hands tightening into fists. I could have moved it to the backyard or stored it in the boathouse, but it wasn't about convenience anymore. It was about principle. My father had always told me, "Never let someone bully you off your own land." That evening, I pulled out my property deeds, maps, and old legal documents. I knew that my land extended 30 feet into the lake, including the dock, but as I studied the maps, I noticed something else. A narrow strip of land leading to the boat ramp also belonged to me. It had been part of the original purchase, overlooked because it was just gravel and weeds, but it connected directly to the only lake access point the rest of the neighborhood used. I sat back in my chair, the beginnings of a plan forming in my mind. If Diane and her board wanted to play games, I could play harder. They thought they had authority over me. They didn't realize I held the keys to the lake. I didn't sleep much that night. My thoughts kept circling back to Diane's smirk, the way she spoke as if my boat was a stain she needed to scrub from her perfect little world. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I was going to do. It wouldn't just be about keeping my boat in the driveway. This was going to be about reminding the HOA, who actually owned the water they loved so much. The first fine arrived 3 days later. A plain white envelope with the HOA's logo, printed in blue ink, slipped under my door like some sort of clandestine threat. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in stiff, formal language. Notice of violation. Per Section 14B of the HOA bylaws, the storage of boats in driveways is prohibited beyond 24 hours. Your noncompliance has resulted in an initial fine of $250, effective immediately. Each additional day will accrue a further fine until resolved. I set the letter down on my kitchen counter and let out a slow breath. They hadn't wasted any time. No grace period, no neighborly conversation, just straight to penalties. The kicker? The Section 14B, they cited, had been added less than a month ago, quietly slipped into the updated rules Diane had mailed out, along with a 10-page packet of other new regulations. I wasn't surprised, but I was irritated. They wanted me to fold under pressure, and if I didn't, they'd try to bleed me financially. I picked up my phone and called the HOA office, which was really just a small converted shed near the front gate. Homeowners Association. This is Carol, a tired voice answered. Hi, Carol. This is Ethan Walker, Lot 14 on Lakeshore Drive. I just got a violation notice about my boat. There was a pause. Papers shuffled in the background. Yes, Mr. Walker, I see it here. You'll need to remove the boat from your driveway to avoid further fines. I'm not removing it, I said evenly. And while we're on the subject, I'd like to remind the board that the only public lake access point is on my property. You might want to discuss that before you start threatening me. The silence stretched long enough that I could picture her blinking in confusion. I'm not sure. What do you mean? I mean, I continued, that the gravel ramp at the end of Lakeshore Road, the one everyone uses to launch their boats, it's mine. Been mine since the day I bought this place. And I've been generous enough to let everyone use it for free. Another pause. I'll let the board know. I hung up before she could say anything else. The seed was planted. 2 days later, I was out on my deck drinking coffee, when I spotted Diane walking toward my driveway again, her clipboard clutched tightly under one arm. Her steps were sharper this time, her jaw set. Mr. Walker, she called, we need to talk about your recent statements to the HOA office. I leaned against the railing. Which statements? About the boat ramp. That land is considered common access under community rules. Maybe under your rules, I said, but not under the county's. I've got the deed to prove it. Her eyes narrowed. If you interfere with lake access, you'll be in violation of... I cut her off. Of nothing. I've read your bylaws, Diane. They don't override private property rights. You might want to get your lawyer before you try pushing that one." For the first time since I'd met her, Diane didn't have a ready comeback. She stood there for a moment, lips pressed thin, then turned and walked away without another word. That was the moment I knew she understood the leverage I had, and I wasn't done yet. That evening, I began putting my plan into motion. I called a friend from my construction days, a guy named Harris who owed me a favor, and asked him to bring over some fencing supplies and a load of gravel. The idea was simple. Block off the boat ramp and post "private property, no public access" signs. By the end of the week, the ramp was closed. The fence wasn't tall, but it was enough to stop anyone from backing a trailer down to the water. The signs were bold and unmistakable, and just to make things extra official, I installed a lockable gate at the top of the ramp. The very next morning, chaos erupted. I could hear shouting from the street, neighbors who had driven down with their boats, only to find their weekend plans ruined. A few tried to rattle the gate, but it held firm. One man stormed up my driveway demanding an explanation. I simply pointed to the "No Access" sign and said, "Talk to your HOA." By Sunday evening, my phone was buzzing nonstop. 3 calls from Carol, 2 from Diane, and even 1 from a board member I barely knew. I ignored them all. If they wanted to talk, they could do it in writing. When Monday rolled around, a formal letter arrived, this time marked urgent. The HOA demanded that I remove the fence and restore public access immediately, citing community harmony and shared resources. I smiled as I read it, because this was exactly where I wanted them. They had overstepped, fined me without negotiation, and now they were about to realize that their control wasn't as absolute as they believed. The game had just shifted in my favor, and I wasn't going to stop at just a locked gate. By Tuesday morning, the lakefront community felt like it was in a low-grade civil war. The fence at the ramp was the dividing line. Those who thought I was a hero for standing up to the HOA, and those who saw me as the villain who had ruined their weekend boating plans. I could feel the stares when I went to get my mail. Some neighbors nodded approvingly, but others shook their heads or muttered under their breath. A few simply avoided eye contact altogether. I knew what they were thinking. Why pick this fight? Why stir up trouble? But they didn't see what I saw. This wasn't just about the boat anymore. This was about control. And I wasn't going to let Diane and her crew keep tightening their grip on the neighborhood without resistance. That afternoon, a letter arrived, not from the HOA this time, but from their lawyer. It was a thick envelope, stuffed with legal jargon, claiming that I was obstructing community access to shared amenities and causing financial harm to property owners. They demanded that I take down the fence within 72 hours or face a lawsuit. I read it twice, then set it down and pulled out my property deed again. The survey map was clear. The ramp and shoreline were mine. The HOA could argue community expectations all they wanted, but they didn't have a legal leg to stand on. Still, I wasn't going to answer them with just words. The next morning, I called Harris again and told him to bring something bigger, heavy equipment. By noon, a small backhoe rumbled down my driveway, drawing curious glances from every porch and window on the street. "Same spot?" Harris asked, nodding toward the ramp. I smiled. "Same spot. But this time, we're going to make it permanent. We dug a trench right across the top of the ramp, filling it with thick wooden posts sunk deep into concrete. Between each post, we laid large boulders, the kind you couldn't move without machinery. By the time we were done, it didn't just look like private property. It looked like a fortress. That night, as the sun went down, I sat on my deck and watched the lake shimmer in the fading light. From here, I could see the empty ramp, blocked off and silent. No trailers, no shouting, no boats sliding into the water. Just peace. But it didn't last long. At sunrise the next day, I woke to the sound of furious pounding on my front door. I opened it to find Diane, red-faced and breathing hard, flanked by 2 board members and a man in a suit I assumed was their lawyer. "This is outrageous," Diane snapped. "You've gone too far, Ethan. The board demands you remove the barricade immediately." I leaned against the door frame, calm as ever. "And I demand the board rescind my fines and issue a written apology. Until then, the ramp stays closed." The lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Walker, you're putting yourself at great legal risk here. You could be liable for damages, and if we take this to court—" "You'll lose," I interrupted, holding up the deed. "This isn't HOA land. This is mine. I paid for it, I maintain it, and I decide who uses it. You've got 72 hours to back off, or I'll start charging the HOA a daily access fee for anyone who wants to launch here." For a moment, nobody spoke. Diane's face twisted into something between fury and disbelief. She wasn't used to people telling her no. Finally, she spun on her heel and marched back toward the street, the others trailing behind. As they left, I called after them. "Oh, and Diane, tell your members to stop trespassing on my property to fish at night. Next time, I'll have the sheriff involved." That hit a nerve. She stiffened, but didn't turn around. Later that day, the neighborhood's private Facebook group exploded. Screenshots of my fence and barricade circulated with comments ranging from "good for him" to "this is going to ruin the community." Some people accused me of being selfish. Others accused the HOA of being tyrants. It was clear the fight had become bigger than just me and Diane. It was now the defining battle of the neighborhood. And I was ready for it to get uglier. Because I still had one last card to play. Something that would hit them where it really hurt, and make sure the HOA never messed with me again. 2 days after the standoff at my front door, I received another letter from the HOA's lawyer. This one was different, shorter, more desperate in tone. They offered to waive my fines if I reopened the ramp in the spirit of community cooperation. It was the first sign of them cracking. But it wasn't enough. They still thought they could save face, pretend this was a compromise instead of a loss. I decided it was time to end this on my terms. That evening, I made a few phone calls to a local news station, a regional boating club, and a county inspector I'd done work for years ago. I told them I had a story they'd want to hear. A homeowner being targeted by an HOA for using his own property. And in retaliation, shutting down the only lake access for the entire neighborhood. They loved it. The boating club agreed to stage a weekend protest at the ramp, and the news crew promised to be there with cameras rolling. Saturday morning, the quiet lakeshore erupted with activity. Trucks towing boats lined the road, their drivers holding signs that read, "Property Rights Matter," and "No More HOA Tyranny." People honked as they drove past, The news crew set up near my deck, getting shots of the barricade, the crowd, and me standing at the gate with my arms crossed. By noon, Diane showed up. She looked rattled, clearly unprepared for the spectacle. The moment she stepped out of her car, a reporter approached her with a microphone, asking why the HOA was trying to control privately owned land. She stumbled over her words, saying something about maintaining standards and community harmony. But it didn't land well. The crowd booed. That was when I pulled out my ace. I walked over, holding a folder in my hand. "Diane," I said loudly enough for the cameras to catch it, "you've been telling everyone this ramp is community property. But here's the county's deed record proving otherwise. And here's a copy of the letter you signed, fining me for storing my boat on my driveway, which, by the way, isn't against county ordinances." The reporter's eyes lit up. "Can we get a shot of that?" I handed over the documents. Diane's face went pale. She muttered something about misunderstandings, but the damage was done. The story had already taken shape. A power-hungry HOA president caught overstepping her authority. The following Monday, the board called an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but I heard through a neighbor that Diane had resigned as president. They also voted to officially acknowledge the ramp as private property and remove the fines from my record. But I wasn't quite done. A week later, I sent the HOA a formal letter of my own. I offered to reopen the ramp for community use, on one condition. The HOA would pay me an annual maintenance fee and sign a written agreement stating they had no authority over my shoreline or driveway. If they refused, the ramp would stay closed forever. They agreed. By summer, the barricade was gone, replaced with a sturdy, freshly paved ramp that I maintained myself. I even put up a sign with my own rules. Access granted at owner's discretion. Respect the property or lose privileges. Everyone followed them. The HOA never bothered me again. Sometimes, when I'm out on the lake in my father's boat, I pass the ramp and think about how easily they could have avoided all this if they'd just left me alone. But then